This podcast is brought to you by Blackaby Ministries International. To find out more, visit blackaby.org.
Welcome back to the Richard Blackaby Leadership Podcast, where we help take your leadership to the next level. My name is Sam, and I'm joined by Dr. Richard Blackaby.
That's right. Good to be with you, Sam.
It's good to have you. I don't say that too often, but you are a doctor after all. So that's, every once in a while I'll throw you that. If you've new to the podcast, welcome. If you've been around for a while, from the beginning even, then you know that every once in a while we do a book review.
Yeah.
And now is one of those once in a whiles. And this month's, or this book at least, is called Originals by Adam Grant. Can you tell us a little bit about why we picked this book? It was actually a book that we did in our own book club.
Yeah.
Tell us why.
We've mentioned this book club before, but I've got several kids and kid-in-laws working with us. I've got a son, a daughter, a son-in-law, two sons, then another son, I guess it's in Canada. But we started this several years ago, where we'll just find a book that we all think would be interesting to read and to stretch us in some way. And then we all read it, and then we order in lunch and we discuss it. And now my oldest son moved 2,800 miles away, but we just FaceTime him in.
Yeah.
Said
he doesn't get the food, but he.
Yeah, we feel bad sometimes.
I don't, but
but yeah, we put his laptop
more food for us
where he would normally be sitting, and then he's fully engaged as well, and we have a great discussion.
Yeah,
and,
they're lots of fun.
And so I'd encourage our listeners, find 3 or 4 people and just read books together. It's, we all read other books on our own, but then it's just fun to also tackle one and then get other people's perspective on what stood out to them.
I think this can be something that you can do if you're not already doing it with perhaps your leadership team in your organization, or if you do it with your peers, maybe outside of your organization. I think either way, or both, or whatever, would be a great way to just sort of stretch you a little bit, to think outside the box some, and to get that diversity of opinions as well.
And when we started this, I'm not sure that any of you guys work with me, but you were just my family, my kids. And so I think we started out just with my sons and daughter, and then you joined in just saying, let's just read a book together. And I'll just tell you as well, as a baby boomer in a book club with everyone else as a millennial, it's a lot of fun just to get that millennial perspective on things. It helps me kind of get a different viewpoint, and it's just fun as a dad in a book club with a bunch of his kids. So I encourage you might just consider that. Throw out a book. It could be a Christian themed book, or like this one's a secular book. But it's been a lot of fun. So this book came out of that. And so
it's got a lot of application to leadership.
Yeah.
For sure.
And it's by Adam Grant, as you said, called Originals. The subtitle is How Non-Conformists Move the World. And he's really looking at people that are entrepreneurial, that are founding new movements or companies or services or products. And he kind of looks at, why is it that some people seem to be so spectacularly successful at creating new things, new products, and then they end up making lots of money, selling lots of products, building a big company. And other people keep trying to find that elusive product or service or whatever it is, and they just never seem good at it or successful. And so he takes a look, and it's interesting. He begins, Adam Grant was a professor, and actually had, I think, 4 students approach him that wanted to start a company, and they were kind of inspired by his teaching. And they offered to have him invest in it at the foundation of it. But he, as he kind of tells in the beginning of the book, turned them down, much to his later regret.
Yeah.
Because he said the things he thought were necessary to be successful, he didn't see in them. For instance, these 4 guys, they all had other jobs, and he kind of felt like, hey, if you're going to make a new product, new company successful, you got to be all in. You can't be 1 foot in the water, 1 foot out. And so They had, I think, co-CEOs, and he felt like, no, you got to really have this one dominant, visionary, compelling, charismatic founder, entrepreneurial type that just sort of drives everything with his charisma, and they don't have that. And so he kind of went down the checklist of what he thought you need to have to be someone who's a compelling leader that creates something new, and they didn't have it. And so he passed on investing in them, and then they became fabulously successful. And he's regretted that ever since. And so it seems that helped become an impetus for him to say, well, what does it take to be successful?
Right.
And there's several things that I think he mentions that are interesting. Now, as far as originality, he has this definition. He says it's taking the road less traveled, championing a set of novel ideas that go against the grain, but ultimately make things better. So to be now he goes on to say nothing is completely original.
Right.
Everybody's stealing from the Greeks or the Romans or someone earlier on, but taking that and then finding something new. And of course, when people do that, so often, after they invent some new invention, people will think, well, I thought about that, or I always wondered about that, or that's such a common thing. I don't know.
Or why didn't I think of that?
Yeah, it's like
when
now
you see that product that you didn't even know that you needed.
Yeah, and then you say, why did he think of that? Why didn't I think of that? And so he kind of unpacks that. There's an interesting, what I like about books like this is that he cites a number of studies that sort of reflect on human nature in different ways. And one of the studies that was interesting is a study of customer service agents that he mentions early on. And he says that when people would call for needing help and so on, he said they discovered, kind of interestingly enough, that if they just ask what is your Internet Explorer or your search engine that you use? Is it Microsoft Internet Explorer? Is it Safari that Apple promotes, or is it Firefox and Chrome? And of course, Firefox and Chrome are not the ones promoted by the Microsoft or Apple.
They don't come default on your computer.
Yeah, they don't come default. And so I thought that was interesting that those who did not use the default search engine actually made much, much better customer service agents, because they didn't stick with the default. They didn't just take what was given to them and say, okay, well, I'll have to search with this. It wasn't so much that the other search engines were better. It just reflected a willingness to try new things, to break out of the norm. It's not like, well, I've got a Microsoft computer and it comes with Internet Explorer, so that's just what I'll use. They were searching, they were questioning, they were wondering, well, maybe this will be better. And they found that people that did not use the default search engine were 19% less likely to miss work. They enjoyed their work more. And the response from customers was much, much higher as well. And you read that and you think, well, I would never think that. I would never think that if I was interviewing someone for a job and I wanted someone that had initiative and creativity and was a self-starter, an interesting question might be, what's your preferred search engine that you use? A simple question like that can show you, here's someone willing to go out of the norms and try new things, and yet someone else perhaps just says, well, this is what they gave me, and I'll just use that. So that was interesting to me, and they say several things in this book that I felt were interesting. For instance, he kind of along that line, he says the starting point is curiosity.
Yeah.
Are you curious, or are you just satisfied just to take what's given to you? But he also says some things, for instance, like child prodigies. You tend to look at a child prodigy and say, this kid's brilliant. They're head and shoulders smarter than all their peers. So I would expect that they'll be very creative because they've got all this brain power. But they said that actually child prodigies tend to not be creative because they're so good at doing what all the adults do, and they're good at learning what they're being taught. And so, for instance, he has a statement: practice may make perfect, but it doesn't make something new. And to become a prodigy means you're like in piano or violin. It means you're practicing, but you're not creating. You're rehearsing what's already
someone
been
else
done.
has already made.
And so you're really good at reproducing what regurgitating what's given to you. But that doesn't mean that you're good at creating anything new. Just memorizing and learning what others have done. And so you sort of think, well, that's counterintuitive a little bit, but it also, now he says that the very word entrepreneur means bearer of risk. And so we tend to think, again, I guess my stereotype of an entrepreneur is someone who's a risk taker, daring, willing to kind of roll the dice and, go for broke.
Right.
Either this will be a great breakthrough or else I'll lose everything. And that's sort of the picture you have, is that they're not afraid to take risks and pay the price, and if it doesn't work out,
they jump and then learn how to fly on the way down.
But Grant actually says that his studies have shown that while an entrepreneur obviously has to take risks to try something new, they may be taking out a loan from the bank to borrow money to start their company. But then he said what they'll tend to do, now he says the foolish ones are all in. I mean, they quit their job, they sell their house, they put all their money into their company, and then if it goes south, they lose everything. They're destitute. But he said the more successful entrepreneurs, they'll have to take a risk. So they may take out a loan from the bank, but then they won't quit their job.
Yeah.
They'll continue to have a source of income while their new company is having time to start making profits. And he gives a number of examples of companies that ultimately were very successful, but the founders didn't just go for broke. They sort of hedged their bets. And along with that, he said that many of the companies that have done the best have been companies that had co-CEOs. And again, that's kind of counterintuitive. You sort of think, well, you got to have this larger than life person like a Steve Jobs who has to be in charge, and he's going to drive the direction and so on. But he would say when you have two CEOs, you've got twice the creativity, twice the problem-solving alertness. There's two pairs of eyes watching for problems instead of just one. Two pairs of eyes and two people that both feel the full weight of making sure this is successful, not just one person. And perhaps a little cautionary sometimes voice when one might be ready to go and another wants to say, well, let's think about this. And so again, it's one of those things where you wouldn't think it that way. And really the whole book is about how, we stereotype these ultra uber sort of creative people that just are driven by this passionate vision and throw everything, caution to the wind, and go for it. Yeah. But there's a whole lot of people that have ended up in failure that we've never heard about because they did that.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a good place to take a quick break, and when we come back, we will dive in a little bit deeper to Originals by Adam Grant.
Whether at home, on the job, or in the ministry, we can all have a greater impact on the world around us for the kingdom of God. Join Richard Blackaby at the Billy Graham Training Center at The Cove to learn about increasing your spiritual influence on April 6th through the 8th, 2020. Space is limited, so register soon at the link in the show notes.
So Richard, like you said before the break, this book, Originals, kind of runs in the face of our stereotypes of entrepreneurs and creative individuals. A lot of what he talks about is sort of hedging their bets and balancing their risk portfolio, as it were. So they're not necessarily going all in to start a new company, but they're dipping a toe in, seeing how it goes, without losing their regular income, as an example. What are some other things that stood out to you in this book as it pertains to leadership?
Well, one of the things as well is that we tend to think of people who create great companies or great products as someone having this brilliant idea, and they just one day it just strikes them, and so they invent this product that becomes wildly successful. But he said actually most of the people who were some of the most famous inventors had far more duds than they had successes. Like Thomas Edison had, many, many patents, but only a handful that he's actually famous for.
Right.
And so he says sometimes the secret to success is actually the volume. He says quantity is the most predictable path to quality. If you produce enough, and what he would say is oftentimes the first couple of things that you come up with aren't that good, and they're certainly not radically different than what already exists. He says we tend to start out with things. He says our first ideas are typically our most conventional and the closest to the default that already exists. And so he says you got to keep on inventing for a while, and you keep on experimenting, and the longer you do that, the more farther afield you go with creativity and new things.
The more novel they become.
Yeah, and he says some interesting things also about along that line. Then he says, so don't be too quick to go to print, or don't go and put your product out too quickly. In fact, he says sometimes procrastination is actually a good thing. I could see where it's not always a good thing, especially if once you've got a good product ready to go. But he says a lot of times people are onto something and they have a good idea, but it's not fleshed out enough yet. They haven't solved enough of its glitches yet. And so sometimes, but we're so concerned about the competition coming out and being first. A lot of times it is good to be first because you become known for that product, even though 3 other competitors come out with a similar product later. But he says sometimes, actually, if you are thinking about an issue and then you put it off for a little bit, you don't just wrap it up yet. You let it kind of hang there. He said there's, I think it's called the Zeigarnik Effect, which means if there's a task that's left unfinished, you actually remember it better than a task that's finished.
Yeah.
And so he kind of says if you've got this lingering issue before you and you're letting it soak and you're marinating in it and thinking about it and putting it off and say, I'm not going to decide yet, oftentimes you end up coming up with a better product, and one with fewer glitches and errors and mistakes. And he says, so sometimes it's actually even wise to let a competitor be first. Let them find out where the landmines are. Let them have the huge cost overruns because they didn't anticipate this issue or this lawsuit, and let them kind of iron that out. And then you come in with a much better product. I like his quote. He said, it's true that the early bird gets the worm, but we can't forget that the early worm gets caught. And so I thought that was interesting. He says timing accounted for 42% of the difference between success and failure.
Yeah.
So you might have been onto a good idea, but you did it too soon. And we've talked about that before. The success of leadership often is in timing. You can do something too late or too early.
Yeah.
But the really successful people are the ones who do it at just the right time for maximum impact. And he says a couple other things that are interesting. One I did think I'm always kind of intrigued by is the whole area of birth order.
Right.
And he says that, again, it seems a little bit counterintuitive, and he looks at something like baseball players, professional baseball players, and he says looking at something like trying to steal a base. Of course, that's a risk. That's risk-taking. You try to steal a base, you can get thrown out and be put out of that inning. But he said that actually the firstborns, as we know, tend to be more responsible. They tend, in many ways, to go to leadership. They tend to be overachievers when it comes to things like academics. So if you're looking at if you've got 3 or 4 kids, maybe they're all boys, and the firstborn statistically may do the best in school. Because he's, of course, the firstborn's most identifies with the parents and the establishment and so on. But and so they tend to also go into management and that kind of thing. But he says that it's the younger siblings, especially the youngest one, that is 10.6 times more likely to take the risk of stealing a base, for instance. So if you've got a firstborn child and a thirdborn child both playing baseball, the younger child is 10 times more likely to try to steal a base than the firstborn child.
Yeah.
Firstborn is thinking about, if I go out, it'll cost the team and the ending will end, and better play it safe. But he goes into a lot of the reasons why younger kids in the birth order are more willing to take risks. And he says over time they will also move into management, and maybe later. But the older they get, the less impactful the birth order will become in that regard. And so I'm always kind of intrigued by that. I'm a firstborn, and so I think I kind of carry the stereotype fairly closely of a firstborn male child. But but I had not thought as much about the younger ones. And again, in a sense, because a lot of creativity comes down to risk taking.
Yeah,
Taking a chance to, instead of just going with what is already there. Being willing to say, maybe this could be better, let's try something different that's never been done before. And so I think, our listeners, some of them are probably the kind of people that just as soon play it safe, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. This is how I've always done it. Let's just keep on doing it this way. But then there are some leaders that are always looking at how things could be better. Why do we have to do it this way? Just because it's always been done this way, is there a better way to get it done? And
he talks about challenging the status quo and not necessarily just accepting the way things are as the way things have to continue to be.
Yeah.
And I found that very fascinating. Another thing that stood out to me was just the effect that you mentioned this earlier, but the effect of procrastination, but also the effect of dabbling in different areas that aren't necessarily, your field of expertise, and how that can help inform, the thing that you do well.
Yeah, and he points out oftentimes it's people that are involved in the arts, even if they're scientists.
Yeah,
the fact that they spend time in the arts actually helps them think more creativity, even when it's to do with like a scientific kind of thing. Something else too that I thought was quite interesting, and it certainly applies to parenting, was that they said there's some, if you're trying to raise creative kids, problem-solving, entrepreneurial type kids, they said that what they found is when they found a very creative, entrepreneurial kind of person, when they were children, their parents, the home they grew up in, tended to have few rules, whereas the less creative kids had lots of rules. If a child has grown up being told everything they're supposed to do, there's not a lot of space left for them to come up and figure it out for themselves. They just do what they're told. But if you've got a handful of rules, then that leaves more, the onus is on you. Okay, so what am I going to do? I've got all this freedom. Only a few things I can't do. That means there's a lot of things potentially I could do. So if you want to raise kids who are creative and entrepreneurial and problem solving, give them as much freedom as possible. But also I thought there was an interesting thing he also said, and that is children that tended to buck the trends and to stand out perhaps and do the right thing were kids that when a child, for instance, when they share, when you've got a preschooler and he shares with his little sister, there's two ways you can respond to that. One is to say, Billy, good for you. It's good to share. You shared with your sister, and sharing is good, and you shared, so that's great. And that's what we tend to do is we highlight the activity.
Right. Billy, the action is.
Yeah, Billy just
that was a
shared,
good thing.
So let's praise him for sharing. But a better way, he says, is when Billy shares with his little sister to say, Billy, you just shared with your sister. You are such a thoughtful, kind, generous person. But I've just seen this in you over and over again. When you see someone in need, you just are such a generous person. And so what they say, of course, is the difference between that is one is just praising an action. The other is praising a character.
Yeah.
And if you focus on children's character, then they realize, well, I am that kind of person. And if I am a generous person, I'm going to always be generous. If I just got praised now and then when I do the right thing, well, now and then when it's convenient, I think I can afford to, I'll do that again. But That doesn't mean that's who I am. It just means that now and then I do good things.
Yeah, it was connecting their identity to that that action as well, saying that, not just that you do this, but like this is the kind of person that you are.
Yeah. So it's a character trait, not just an action. It's your identity. And so, again, I thought that was interesting as you're parenting. And of course, when you've got kids, you don't want them to get in lots of trouble. And I've known parents that felt like, well, let's just surround our kids with a lot of different rules so that they don't get into trouble. But if you're not careful, you'll stifle their creativity, and they'll just become conformists. In fact, Grant says an interesting thing. He says usually the most creative entrepreneurial type people were not the teacher's pets in school.
Yeah.
They were typically viewed as trouble, the ones who kept pushing the limits all the time.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because we often see kids that are always obedient, always follow the rules, always please the parents. And then when they become adults, suddenly they become derelicts, and they become drug addicts. And we look at that and we think, how on earth did that happen? They were such good kids growing up. They always followed the rules. They always did the right thing. Why is it that when they got older, suddenly what happened to them? It's like they became demon possessed or something. It's not the same child that I knew. But the reality is that they were people pleasers. And when they were children, they just sought to please their parents, because that was the greatest influence in their life. But they went to college and they started trying to please their roommate and their college friends, and they were doing drugs. They were having big parties they were going to, and so they had never learned how to push back on things or to sort of take a stand for what they thought was right. They just always went along with the prevailing custom and activity that was going on, and so they're still doing that. And sometimes the kids who kept pushing back in school and kept questioning things and questioning their parents, and they were seen as rebels as children, and why can't you just do what you're told? Why do you have to always ask why? Why do you have to push back and try it your way instead of just doing it the way we've always done it? And these kids are viewed as trouble when they're younger. But oftentimes when they grow up, you discover that's because they just don't like being given the answer. They want to work it out themselves, and they feel innately that there's a better way to do this, and they want to discover what it is. So, you may have a child right now that's that way, that's giving you grief, or a student that is constantly pushing back and doesn't just accept the answer because you said so. Don't be too disheartened by that, because they may actually be the folks who create the new products and services and ministries and so on in the future, because they weren't satisfied just to take the default, but to say, I think there's something better. And certainly in the day in which we live, we need to be developing people who are problem solvers, who say, well, instead of complaining about how things are, why couldn't we make them better? Maybe there's a product we come up with, or a new service or activity that would make the church better. So we need to be doing everything we can in our own staff, with ourselves, and certainly with the kids we raise, to be helping nurture them so that they are creative people that just might create something original that ultimately makes the world a better place.
Well, it's a great book. Highly recommend it for anyone who's leading in any capacity, even yourself. It helps you, I think better and think differently about the world around you. And we'd love to hear what your thoughts were on it. If you read it along with us, or if you're going to read it in the future,
maybe join our reading club.
Drop us a line. podcast@blackaby.org. And for the next book, we don't always do this, but we try to let you know in advance. The next book is called Ego is the Enemy by Ryan Holiday. And so in probably about a month's time, we're going to open that up and see how it can help us be better leaders. And until next time.
Thanks for listening to the podcast. If this is something you enjoyed, it really makes a difference if you leave a review and a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen. Don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends. We always love hearing from our listeners, so email us at podcast@blackaby.org.